Harold Garfinkel, 1917 to 2011, a biographical sketch. Harold Garfinkel was born on October 29, 1917, in Newark, New Jersey. His father, Abraham Garfinkel, owned a small furniture business, and after Harold graduated from high school, the family decided that he would take business courses at the University of Newark and go into the furniture business as well. According to Garfinkel, the business courses he took in college, particularly one called Theory of Accounts, influenced his later work as much as or more than did the work of C. Wright Mills and Kenneth Burke, whose social theories he would later study. As you will shortly see, ethnomethodologists are particularly intrigued by accounting practices, that is, by the way in which actors offer accounts in order to make sense out of events. Throughout his long and illustrious career, Garfinkel was most interested in how formal analytic theorizing creates an orderly social world out of indicators, that is, how actors use signs and categories methodically to make sense of the world. After he graduated from the University of Newark in 1939, Garfinkel decided not to join the family's furniture business. Instead, he enrolled in graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In 1942, Garfinkel completed a master's thesis on intra-racial and interracial homicide. This was a sophisticated investigation into the institutional production of statistics and accounts and the social construction of racial differences. Based on observations in court cases and court records on homicides, Garfinkel concluded that the formulation and processing of cases within races was different from that between races. Garfinkel's education was interrupted by World War II and his enlisting in the Air Force. After the war, Garfinkel decided to attend Harvard to study with Talcott Parsons, rather than go back to Chapel Hill. In 1952, Garfinkel completed his doctoral thesis, which was essentially an extended debate with Parsons as to the relative importance of empirical detail versus conceptual categories and generalizations. Garfinkel served on the faculty at the University of California, Los Angeles from 1954 to 1987. He remained active in the discipline until his death on April 21, 2011. Garfinkel's intellectual influences and core ideas. Ethnomethodology literally means the study of the methods people use to accomplish their everyday lives. The basic premise of ethnomethodology is that people do what they do, right there and then, to be reasonable and effective, and they do so for pervasively practical reasons and under unavoidably local conditions of knowledge, action, and material resources. Like phenomenology, ethnomethodology is concerned with how individuals make sense of their everyday circumstances. Both emphasize that we accept as unquestionable the world of facts which surrounds us, and both pay attention to the methods or procedures that individuals use to interpretively produce the recognizable, intelligible forms of action that, paradoxically, they treat as facts. In short, both are intrigued by the suspension of doubt that sustains our everyday world. The central difference between phenomenology and ethnomethodology is that, while phenomenology has deeply influenced and been influenced by psychology, ethnomethodology is resolutely sociological. Indeed, as the subtitle of one of Garfinkel's books, Ethnomethodology's Program, Working Out Durkheim's Aphorism, makes clear, this perspective is based on a direct response to Durkheim's famous dictum discussed above, that the concreteness of social facts is sociology's most fundamental phenomenon. Ethnomethodologists seek to explain how people make joint sense of their social world together and how they do so methodically, using social procedures or methods that they share. In other words, instead of focusing on the cognitive or psychological aspects of sense-making and perceptions, ethnomethodologists attribute the very existence of an apparently real world to the interactional and interpretive skills of individual actors. In so doing, they shift the focus from the real world to a reality constituting procedures that are carried out during social interaction. Consider, for instance, a visit to the doctor. When the doctor comes into the examination room, she begins with a friendly hello and chat about the upcoming holiday. Then she asks, "So what brings you here today?" And you begin to describe your stomach pains. This completely routine, but nevertheless complex interaction involves much more than a simple internalization and acting out of pre-programmed norms or an automatic exchange of gestures. Rather, the success of this interaction depends on both actors' ability to read and respond to verbal and nonverbal cues on the spot. In this way, everyday interaction is more like a dance using shared methods or steps than it is an instance of predetermined socialization. For instance, you and the doctor must gain a sense of exactly how much small talk in which to engage before getting to the point. You won't spend 20 minutes answering the doctor's question about the holidays. So, too, your response is based on a quick, implicit assessment as to whether the doctor seems friendly and sincere or rushed and mechanical. Bioethnomethodologists focus on social interaction and behavior rather than abstract mental phenomena, and thus share much with other sociologists. They are highly They are highly critical of work associated with conventional forms of sociological theory. First, ethnomethodologists reject the fundamental sociological conceit, especially apparent in structural functionalism and the Frankfurt School. See chapters 2 and 3. That actors' views of their social worlds are somehow flawed or marginal to a full understanding of social phenomena. In other words, ethnomethodologists condemn those perspectives that construe actors as judgmental dopes. Second, ethnomethodologists criticize conventional approaches for naively taking for granted the same skills, practices, and suppositions as the unenlightened members of the society they are studying. Ethnomethodologists strive for ethnomethodological indifference, an attitude of detachment that is rooted in neither intellectual naivety nor condescension. They seek to suspend belief in a rule-governed order in order to observe how the regular, coherent, connected patterns of social life are described and explained in ways that create that order itself. That is, they seek to understand how people see, describe, and jointly develop a definition of the situation. This brings us to breaching experiments. Garfinkel's method for identifying the building blocks of everyday interaction was to formulate experiments that disrupt normal procedures in order to expose them. The point of breaching experiments is to modify the objective structure of the familiar, known and common environment by rendering the background expectancies imperative. An effective breaching experiment, 1. Makes it impossible for the subject to interpret the situation as a game or experiment or deception. 2. Makes it necessary for the actor to reconstruct the natural facts of the encounter. And 3. Deprives the actor of consensual support for an alternative definition of the situation. In short, breaching experiments work much in the same way that culture shock does, by thrusting into consciousness the basic elements of a previously taken for granted world. For instance, in one experiment you will read about following. Garfinkel asked his students to spend 15 minutes to an hour interacting with their family members as if they were boarders or not intimates. They were instructed to conduct themselves in a circumspect and polite fashion. They were to avoid getting personal, to use formal address, to speak only when spoken to. Garfinkel reports that in 4/5 of the cases, family members were stupefied. They vigorously sought to make the strange actions intelligible and to restore the situation to normal appearances. The point is that the families were stupefied because their taken for granted world was challenged, and therefore their normal procedures for making sense of things were rendered useless or at least questionable, and the situation produced more than a little anxiety. Indeed, while always controversial, such stress-inducing experiments are no longer considered ethical. Comedy reality shows, such as Punk'd and long before that, Candid Camera, have no compunction carrying out their own versions of Garfinkel's stress-inducing breaching experiments, however. Candid Camera, which premiered in 1948, used hidden cameras to catch unsuspecting guests trying to figure out and deal with hoaxes such as mailboxes that talked or moved. Similarly, the short-lived cable show Boiling Point placed unsuspecting victims in situations that tried their patience, such as watching helplessly as a florist keeps cutting and cutting flowers out of their already paid-for bouquet. The television audience watched as the clock ticked down, and if the victim was still involved in the interaction without using profanity after a given time limit, their patience was rewarded with $100. In the spirit of Garfinkel's breaching experiments, these shows were based on observing how unsuspecting victims respond to slight or not so slight disruptions in their taken for granted world. Yet it is not only reality-based comedy that is related to ethnomethodology. Identifying the intricate, taken for granted elements of everyday life, and then commenting on, satirizing, or subverting them is central to many stand-up comedians and slapstick comedians as well. For example, comedian George Carlin's famous routine on the 7 words you can't say on television epitomizes how comedians expose and then violate core but unspoken recipes. As Carlin quips, I think it's the duty of the comedian to find out where the line is drawn and cross it deliberately. So too, Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update is based on an exact imitation of newscasters' actual comments, mannerisms, demeanor, and so on, coupled with an unexpected jolt from not following the script, as in Chevy Chase's famous recurring line, "Good evening, I'm Chevy Chase, and you're not." Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and The Colbert Report, hosted by Stephen Colbert, are rooted in a similar tack, parodying both newscasters and cocky correspondents in the field, as well as political pundit programs. One of the central methods that actors use to order and make sense of their everyday worlds, and that breaching experiments were explicitly, is accounting practices. For instance, in Garfinkel's experiment with children and parents, parents typically responded to the unexpected behavior of their child by constructing and attributing motives that looked to the past to explain the present. The student was working too hard in school. The student was ill. There had been another fight with a fiancé. Here, parents are trying to make accountable the behavior observed. Garfinkel emphasizes that the process of accounting is vital to the sustenance of reality because it is what enables us to believe that social life is coherent and that meaning is shared. One of the most important features of accounting practices is indexicality. Taken from linguistics, the term indexical refers to the fact that just as words have different meanings in different contexts, so too all expressions and practical actions are interpreted in a particular context. Consider, for instance, the following conversation. A. I have a 14-year-old son. B. Well, that's all right. A. I also have a dog. A. Oh, I'm sorry. At first glance, this conversation appears incoherent or nonsensical. However, once we are told that A is a would-be tenant of an apartment and B is the landlord, the conversation makes perfect sense. Then we recognize that the conversation is an exchange about issues that might disqualify the potential tenant from the rental. This is indexicality. The centrality of both accounting practices and indexicality to ethnomethodology is evident in Garfinkel's very definition of ethnomethodology as the investigation of the rational properties of indexical expressions and other practical actions as contingent on ongoing accomplishments of organized artful practices of everyday life. Everyday life is made up not only of determining the meaning of objects or practices within a given context, but also of inferring meaning by creating or attributing a context or index when one is not readily apparent, as the experiment makes clear. Thus, for example, staring out staring out at pouring rain, a speaker observes, "What a wonderful summer we are having," and the hearer concludes that the remark was intended to be ironical. In sum, the everyday world is created and sustained by our ability to make definite sense with indefinite resources. Human descriptive resources, our abilities to understand the situations that we face, are only approximate. They do not reflect or correspond directly to real states of affairs, but rather provide a field of possibilities. Individuals must actively perform contextualizing work in order to see what the descriptions used in encounters means. This brings us back to the concept of typification. Recall that for Schutz, language is the principal tool for typifying the elements in all encounters. That is, it is a kind of treasure house of ready-made, pre-constituted types and characteristics, all socially derived and carrying along an open horizon of unexplored content. As John Heritage states, language is the medium through which common sense equivalence classes are constituted and communicated. It embodies a continual compromise between generality and specificity. There is thus an inherently approximate relationship between the descriptor and the range of states of affairs it may be used to describe. In the 1960s, ethnomethodologists' emphasis on language as a constituting practice combined with new technology to produce a new direction in the field, called conversation analysis. Conversation analysis infuses the ethnomethodological interest in the details of mundane everyday action and the production of order with a rigorous methodology and focus on the fundamental, taken for granted structures of conversational interaction. Using audio and videotape for recording conversations as they naturally occur, and linguistic conventions for meticulously coding and analyzing them, conversation analysts investigate not only the use of words, but also the hesitations, cutoffs, restarts, silences, breathing noises, throat clearings, sniffles, laughter and laughter-like noises, prosody, and the like. Not to mention the nonverbal behaviors available on video records that are usually closely integrated with the stream of actively captured on the audio tape. Conversation analysts have been quite prolific in the past 30 years, successfully uncovering the characteristic features of such phenomena as conversational openings and closings, turn-taking and interruptions, as well as applause and booing. Yet, ironically, by taking a more positivistic approach to conversational structures, conversation analysts have veered away from ethnomethodology's phenomenological roots. In contrast to Bertrand Luckman and Schutz, conversation analysts are not interested in studying the actor's consciousness or a community of shared understandings, but rather only in studying observable, measurable behaviors. Put in another way, conversation analysts are interested in the architecture of intersubjectivity, rather than intersubjectivity itself. Garfinkel's theoretical orientation. In terms of action, akin to phenomenology, ethnomethodology's emphasis on the taken-for-granted world reflects a primarily non-rational approach, since the taken-for-granted world is not open to conscious, cost-benefit, or rational analysis. For ethnomethodologists, even the seemingly rational ways in which we seek to save face and strategically negotiate through everyday life rely on a bevy of typifications, recipes, and other cognitive resources that we do not question until they are breached or exposed or proving inadequate. This non-rational bent is illustrated in Figure 6.3. In terms of order, ethnomethodologists confer on actors a great deal of agency, which reflects a prioritization of the level of the individual. They attribute the very existence of an apparently real world to the interactional and interpretive skills of individual actors, and they emphasize that social order is maintained only by individuals in interaction, and that pre-existing symbolic patterns are themselves created and recreated in everyday interaction. To be sure, this emphasis on agency and practical action should not be mistaken for a view of action as infinite or open to all possibilities. 4. Like phenomenologists, particularly Berger and Luckman, ethnomethodologists fully recognize the role played by pre-existing symbolic structures in shaping accounting practices, that is, the significance of the collective, non-rational realm. However, in parallel with phenomenology, ethnomethodologists are routinely criticized for ignoring the collective, rational dimensions of society. They are perceived as obsessed with the trivial, micro-level details of everyday life at the expense of larger social structural concerns, e.g., inequality, globalization. Reading: Introduction to Studies in Ethnomethodology. This excerpt from Garfinkel's groundbreaking work in ethnomethodology features his famous breaching experiments. As indicated previously, the purpose of breaching experiments is to make the underlying assumptions that guide commonplace scenes visible and to illuminate background understandings and social effects. Breaching experiments highlight the common denominators between phenomenology and ethnomethodology, as well as Garfinkel's reliance on Schutz. While they focus on behavior, breaching experiments uncover the basic, taken for granted elements of the attitude of daily life as well. Put in another way, breaching experiments make individuals suspend the suspension of doubt that sustains our everyday world.